One way that President Donald Trump often cultivates support for his xenophobic immigration policies is to fear-monger about immigrants. I mean, he launched his campaign by saying immigrants that come here from Mexico, they're rapists, they're criminals. And so this ongoing fear-mongering is a way of talking about an issue that I think resonates with his voters. But in an interview with Jake Tapper on CNN, Bernie Sanders was asked to respond to Donald Trump's fear-mongering about undocumented immigrants. And I think that Bernie Sanders had a really powerful response to Donald Trump's fear-mongering. And I wanted to share what he had to say because it really does show that our side does have the moral high ground in this debate.
President Trump says that he is giving voice to people who don't get heard from. For instance, he's suggesting that Democrats need to focus more on the victims of crime committed by undocumented immigrants instead of looking at the children separated at the border. I want you to take a listen at this from President Trump on Friday.
These are the stories that Democrats and people that are weak on immigration, they don't want to discuss, they don't want to hear, they don't want to see, they don't want to talk about.
How do you respond to President Trump making that argument? How come Democrats... Go ahead.
I respond in two ways. Number one is I understand that the crime rate among undocumented people is actually lower than the general population. Number two, where was Trump bemoaning the fact that we had a guy in Las Vegas shooting down dozens and dozens of Americans? We had a young American walking into a high school in Parkland, Florida, shooting down kids. Crime is terrible. Murder is terrible. Let's deal with those issues, and let's not suggest that the only causes of crime are coming from undocumented people. But once again, what our job is a government is to address the issues facing the American people. And time again, Jake, we have a president who lied to the American people, a president who told us he was going to take on the pharmaceutical industry. He lied. Drug prices are going up all across this country. He was going to guarantee during his campaign health care to everybody. More and more people have no health insurance. The cost of health care is going up. Unemployment is low. But for millions of workers, real wages are going down because of the cost of affordable housing soaring, prescription drugs soaring, gasoline at the pump soaring.
So that to me was great. The overall argument and implication really is that Donald Trump is given a voice to people who have been affected by the crimes of undocumented immigrants. But what Bernie Sanders says here is that the crime rate among undocumented people is actually lower than the general population. This is true. This is an inconvenient fact for people like Donald Trump. Trump's underlying implication here by saying that is that immigrants are more likely to commit crime than citizens, but they're actually statistically less likely to commit crime. As Richard Perez Pena of the New York Times reports, several studies over many years have concluded that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than people born in the United States, and experts say the available evidence does not support the idea that undocumented immigrants commit a disproportionate share of crime. Analyses of census data from 1980 through 2010 show that among men ages 18 to 49, immigrants were 1/2 to 1/5 as likely to be incarcerated as those born in the United States. Across all ages and sexes, about 7% of the nation's population are non-citizens, while figures from the Justice Department show that about 5% of inmates in state and federal prisons are non-citizens. Now, what Bernie Sanders also does here is he exposes how Donald Trump is really virtue signaling here. He's pretending to take the moral high ground and to represent people whose voices aren't being represented by Congress. But what Bernie Sanders is saying is that if Donald Trump truly wants to make sure that people aren't harmed and that we reduce violence, then as president, he can use his bully pulpit to push for something that would in fact reduce violence, at least gun violence. He can call for universal background checks, which more than 90% of the country supports. He can call for a ban on assault weapons and bump stocks. He can call for a weapons buyback program to reduce the amount of guns already in circulation in the United States, but Trump is choosing to do nothing. So you can't claim to care about violence and protecting American families if you're not willing to attack that issue in a multitude of ways. You can't just say, oh, well, this type of violence is bad, but this type of violence is acceptable. That's not the way this works. Either you're against violence or you're not against violence. Bernie Sanders, like everyone, is against crime in general, which is what I think crimes committed by undocumented immigrants is, that's a category that they would fall under. But I mean, if you really are, if Donald Trump is specifically worried about crime committed by undocumented immigrants, regardless of how small that percentage is, there are things he can do to reduce not just crimes committed by undocumented immigrants, but crimes committed by everyone. You could end the drug war. If you legalized drugs, or at least decriminalized drugs, do you know what type of a transformative effect that would have on gang violence in this country? It would be huge. It would be momentous. But Trump's not talking about that. You can provide people in socioeconomically disadvantaged communities with economic opportunity, with a jobs program, but Trump's goal isn't to provide solutions to people's problems. His goal is simply just to demonize immigrants. In fact, if Donald Trump had a hypothetical red button where if he pressed that, it would solve the problem of immigration, I would guess that he wouldn't do that. Because if he solves the problem of immigration, then what happens? He has nothing to run on in 2020. It's kind of the way that Republicans continuously run on abortion, but if push comes to shove, if you really press them, they probably would rather have abortion be legal than illegal because it gives them something to rally the troops around. It helps them galvanize support. So they want the country to be fucked up because it helps them politically. Trump isn't interested in solutions. Bernie Sanders is interested in solutions. Trump is interested in his own career as a politician and his own ego. So he's saying that he cares about crime and he really wants to protect people who have been abandoned, when in actuality, we all know that that's not true. If he cared about crime, he'd do something to bring down the crime rates. There are indirect policies like decriminalizing drugs and ending the drug war that would have a gigantic impact on gang violence. But he's not doing that. So he's full of shit, and I love how Bernie Sanders basically takes his fear-mongering head on and calls him on his bullshit by pointing out this other issue that Trump is refusing to address. If you're in favor of protecting Americans, then put your money where your mouth is and use your bully pulpit to enact gun reform, end the wars, end the war on drugs. But he's not going to do that because Donald Trump is just about hating immigrants. That's what helped him get elected, and he's going to use that same strategy to try to win in 2020. So Bernie Sanders really is the only one who has meaningful responses to Trump's lunacy. And that's why I think Bernie Sanders would be a powerful opponent if he did face off against Donald Trump in 2020.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.